Hello, I'm Oriana Fox. Thank you for tuning in to Multiple O's, the spin-off podcast for my talk show, The O Show. The O Show is a live performance piece that mines the conventions of daytime TV talk shows for all that they're worth. It features artists and other experts who have no difficulty spilling the beans about their lives and opinions, especially when they defy norms and conventions. So if you're interested in candid confessions, nonconformity, creativity, and mental health, you've come to the right place. All right, here I go.
You go for it.
Okay, here I go. All right, so how can I do justice to the inimitable Lois Weaver? She's an artist, activist, and an educator, an icon of feminist avant-garde performance who's been making work since before I was born.
Oh, no.
Literally.
Oh, no. Oh, no. It's one thing to be the same age as your parent, but before you were born.
Sorry. Oh, it's not that bad. It's good.
No,
anyway,
I know.
It's good
I had the opportunity to respond, so I did.
That's good. So she's lived the American dream of sorts, born in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia into a working-class family, and went on to forge an award-winning career in New York City's experimental theater scene. Touring works abroad and eventually reaching the top rank of academia in London. She is the director.
My sister said I pulled the wool over their eyes, so there you go.
Oh, what a mean sister.
I know. Go ahead.
She is the director and co-founder with longtime collaborator Peggy Shaw of the company Britches, which, among many accolades, won the Innovative Theater Awards Lifetime Artistic Achievement Award in 2017. So many awards. In 2014, Lois was a Guggenheim Fellow, and shortly thereafter, a Wellcome Trust Engaging Science Fellow. She got the WOW Women in Creative Industries Fighting the Good Fight Award in 2018, and the honors keep rolling in. Most recently this year, that's 2021, Split Britches theater piece come Zoom film Last Gasp has been nominated for the Drama League Award for Outstanding Digital Production. So not even a pandemic can stop this woman from being creative. She has been and continues to be very prolific, if that isn't already clear, making work in theater spaces, community halls, and on YouTube. In terms of content, now let's get to the good stuff already. Her oeuvre has entailed working with, as she herself puts it, quote, disrupting performance and audience relationships, disrupting gender, celebrating sexuality, exploring sensuality and eroticism, concentrating on relationships, women's relationships to the intimacy of their lives, women's relationships to the enormity of their relationships, unquote. After many years of staging shows about the butch-femme dynamic, being in it and subverting it at the same time, and her partnership with Peggy Shaw as Split Britches, around about the mid-90s, Lois longed to investigate the visibility of a femme on her own. And she had to move all the way to London to do that.
That's true. I had to get out of town.
Lois is a professor, so not just a regular lecturer. FYI, here in the UK, that title professor signifies reaching the pinnacle of academic excellence, the top rung of the ladder there. So she's a professor of contemporary performance at Queen Mary, University of London. But seriously, she knows how to teach, and she's very influential. In fact, on this very podcast, the 2 episodes that have already been released, both artists I interviewed mentioned you spontaneously of their own accord for 2 different reasons. So Hamja Hassan, who's an introvert, pride person, brought Lois up for your pioneering method of public engagement called the long table. He advocated that it should be applied in all arenas of public life, from the cafe to the parliament. And he was adamant that this would be revolutionary.
Wow.
And then when Joshua Sofair and I were discussing artists who make autobiographical, or what I would call self-disclosing performance, not just as a rite of passage or as a foray into less personal work, but all the way through into later life, which, by the way, he said he loves. That's 3 loves. He loves watching that work. And it was your name, Lois, that he used to exemplify this. So yes, Lois Weaver, she needs no introduction, so I better hurry up and shut up and get on with speaking with her. So I want to talk to you today about everything, about art, pleasure, politics, about alter egos, and orgasms into later life. So let's get started.
Oh, yeah, let's do that. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. That was wonderful. I feel much better today. You should have called me up a long time ago. Cheered me up.
That's good. That's what I'm here for. Yeah. So yeah, where to begin? I guess, I want to say how we met. We first met, I was a participant in your workshop at Arts Admin about directing and collaboration. And one of the most memorable moments for me was like completely anecdotal, like nothing to do with your teaching methods, which obviously also impacted on me, not to negate that, but just was about you were sort of speaking about your relationship with Peggy and being the feminine one and like being sort of in, I don't know, I guess it was, wanting to break free of that kind of, that dynamic. Or it was the first time that I, as a straight person, like had an insight into the fact that, like, because as a straight person, as a straight woman, I've always just looked to the queer world as like, they know what, like they've kind of worked it out. Like they, it must be so much better. Like that dynamic between, masculine people and feminine people must be, completely liberated and from its, the trap of heteronormativity. And I just was like, oh, it isn't like, so it just gave me this kind of sense of like, oh, so the things that happen with this dynamic are then placed onto within those relationships too.
Well, we all watched the same movies, We all were given the same kind of role models. Those of us who are queer had the benefit of twisting those models a little bit, but we all had the same sort of external influences about what it means to be the things that we end up being. Anyway, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, that's all. That was my kind of like
that was the entree.
Well, I think what it is like all through art school, I wanted to make images of like female desire, whatever that is. And the only, like the best things I could find that I felt like were expressing my desire were all like, were all lesbian and queer representations. Like I just could not find a straight representation that I could identify with. So I don't know. Yeah, that was my kind of confession of,
I think being queer for me gave me the freedom, I think, to embrace the stereotype, where I think sometimes being heterosexual, you have to seriously reject the stereotype because it's placed so, and imprinted so definitely on who you are and who your relationships are. And I think being queer, we just had the freedom to like go ahead and go right into that stereotype and then embrace it. And then, like I said, twist it or pervert it or subvert it and so on. So, yeah. But I mean, when you said the word relationship, I think relations are just difficult, no matter what you're able to bring to them. When you put 2 different people in the room, or you put 2 different people in a cottage, or you put it in a house where they've been living together in a pandemic, you're going to encounter all the same things. I mean, I look at international relations, and I think that's just like my relationship with Peggy. That kind of, inability to really understand what that person is saying and therefore make a decision based on that is really difficult. And I think the more you know someone, sometimes the harder that is. Although some of the decisions as you get older make themselves in a way. But I still think it's really hard to really know, how another person functions to the extent that you can, collaborate with that and make it work.
Yeah. Well, speaking of collaboration, that's another thing that I kind of envy, though, about your career. It's like, I think it's maybe a difference of like, I come from a fine art background. And so everything's been about like me as the individual artist making things on my own. And whereas, well, that workshop that you did was all about, collaboration and, directing yourself, directing other people, and that kind of, working through that dynamic. And I still, to this day, I don't think I've had a really successful collaboration with anyone. So really kind of in awe of that aspect of your work.
Well, I think, to be honest, I might envy you a little bit in the sense that I have always had this fantasy of what it must be like to be a solo artist, in the sense that you go into your own studio and you come up with your own ideas and follow through on those, be it a painting or performance or whatever. I have a real, probably romanticized notion of what that is, and I always thought that if I were to start over, I'd want to be an independent fine artist. That would be the road I would take. But I think for me, the idea of collaborating started really early on, because I didn't feel like I had enough of my own ideas, and I've always felt dependent on the ideas of others. I admit dependency is not a great word. I've always been greedy for the ideas of others, and always, wanted to make things in that context of community. Maybe that's because I was I was the baby of the family by 10 years, and so I had a very solitary existence, and I grew up in a very isolated environment. And I always say that I grew up knowing that I would have to move to a place where people would still be awake when I went to sleep, because I couldn't bear the solitude of that darkness. And I think probably some of my instincts to collaborate might have come out of that as well, But having said that, I think that it's more true what I said at the beginning, which is I don't feel like I have enough of my own ideas. I really feel I feel fuller when I have other people around me contributing.
Yeah, I can relate to that too, because I definitely grab at other people's idea. I reenact or I parody, or I never feel like I'm just, it's always been a process of how do I get to find my own voice. And, but anyway, I want to ask more though about the butch and femme roles and your relationship to femininity. And I know in recent works, Peggy's been talking about her relationship with kind of hegemonic masculinity, or and that as being exemplified by Trump or whatever. And I'm just wondering about you and your femininity. Are there any aspects of femininity that you find to be problematic, or that you don't identify with? Or I mean, you parody femininity. And well, I really liked your something you said. I don't know if you want to say something first, but I was going to quote you.
I was probably going to quote myself, but you go first.
You said your alter ego, Tammy Whynot. You said her sense of wonder and her ability to fail gloriously and without shame were her superpowers, and she became your hyper-femme superhero. And her wisdom of why not gave you a definition you'd been searching for of resistant femme, a highly competent woman who just looks like she needs help.
Absolutely. That was what I was going to say. That last little quote, that last little phrase is the thing I've lived by, I think. In the sense that I've embraced the same aspects of femininity that I also reject, which would be learned helplessness. I think that's the thing that I've rejected over the years. And to be honest, I feel lucky that it wasn't encouraged in me as a kid, that I was encouraged to be independent, to make my choices, to make my own things, and not to depend in that sense on other people, and to learn to be helpless. I didn't have that, but I've enjoyed performing that. So that idea of the performing the learned helplessness, or looking like I need a little help when everyone can see that under the blonde wig there's a brain that could take something apart and put it back together again, has been the greatest pleasure of my performing femme, actually. So that has, has always been my model of femininity. And when I've been asked over the years, mostly by butches, I'll point out, when am I going to make a performance that explicates the whole nature of femness or femininity? And I have tried. I tried a lot. I tried in various ways. One of the ways Peggy and I both tried is we did a performance based on Paris music hall stars who were sort of the early Madonnas, of our culture, because they wrote, directed, performed in, designed the costumes for, were the stars of their own show. And so, we started to make some work to think about what does that mean when a femme is on her own on stage. But even then, I don't know, I just couldn't quite get to the essences of what it was that appealed to me that were not in relation to the butch dynamic, which is something that Peggy and I kind of latched onto really early on because we knew it was good theater. We knew that sort of playing, Barbara Streisand and Neil Diamond was good theatrical fodder for us, to lip sync to those characters, or to play with Sid Caesar and Imogene Coco and Mike Nichols and Elaine May. These theatrical couplings were really felt like good performance material for us, and so we latched onto our butch femme almost as much out of that as we did out of any kind of personal desire. But then I also think early on in my coming out, which was when I was in my 30s, we would talk about the old lesbian bars, the old, particularly both of us, Peggy and I, coming from working class environment, the old lesbians that we knew and had become aware of as youngsters were butch and femme. That's how they survived. That's how they identified. And we had a great love and respect for that history. And I think part of us wanted to embrace that as well, So, yes, I think those two things were the bedrock of our having started to play with those things. And then as we began to play with them, then we began to compete with how we managed to keep space for each other and independently with that. So,
what do you mean by that? Keep space?
Well, I think again, as I was saying again, we keep space. What do I mean by that? I guess when we did choose role models that we were playing with, let's say Sid Caesar and Imogene Coco, or various comedy teams, we always chose the ones that had equal footing on stage, that they all shared the same amount of space. I think that's what I mean. I
definitely noticed that in your productions, that it's your collaborations, that they're very much like, there's definitely not like the sense of the masculine overtaking or being too prominent or more prominent or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, because, certainly comedy, certainly, again, growing up in the 50s, as Peggy and I did, it was very easy for the housewife to be the butt of the joke, or the woman to be the butt of the joke. And so, and then, and that was one of the things feminists, as we started out or certainly I did, started out as a feminist performer, feminists were not supposed to be funny, because the joke was always on us.
Absolutely. I wanted to get to that, so I'm glad you got there.
and so it was with my work with Spider-Woman, the first show that I did with a company I worked with, Spider-Woman, which is
I didn't mention them because it was just going to get longer.
That's all right. It was a long time ago. But they're Native American, predominantly Native American, African American, and white working class women came together to make this company. And our first piece was called Women in Violence. And our director, Muriel Miguel, my mentor, insisted that we work with the dirty joke, because or even the joke was the male prerogative, and often it inflicted violence on women, didn't it? So we wanted to grab hold of that, use it, and turn it around. And that was the first time I actually thought about that and realized that, one, we weren't meant to be funny, and two, that we weren't meant to be funny because we were often the butt of the joke. So that was the beginning of wanting to work with humor that way.
Yeah, because I was going to bring it up in relation actually to your performance as Tammy Whynot, and I think it's fantastic that you did your inaugural lecture as a professor as Tammy Whynot, because I think I often talk about, like, I don't, or at least I think now it's changing more, but I had this feeling for many years that a woman wouldn't do like that kind of playing dumb persona that like someone like Andy Warhol does. Like, I just feel like women artists always have to be, the experts on their work, and they have to speak about it in this very articulate kind of academic way. And they can't be like this silly or obtuse person who's just like, oh, well, what do you think? Or I don't know, or just, because I guess they would worry about it not being seen as a persona. They would think that people just believe they were idiots or something.
Absolutely.
So I feel like, so that's why I think it's so wonderful about you're using this moment of recognition for your academic career to, and playing, the role of Tammy, who is maybe more like a silly woman. Or
I didn't follow through on your when you brought Tammy up before. When I was talking about having made all these attempts to describe or unpick the femininity or the performance of femininity, it wasn't until I just didn't land on Tammy. Tammy's been with me a long time in different forms, but suddenly realized it was Tammy that allowed me to sort of both embody that kind of femininity, but wouldn't be broken by it. I mean, Dolly Parton's the perfect example of that. I mean, Peggy used to always say, Dolly can talk about her tits all she wants, but if you thought someone was going to get any close enough to touch them without her permission, they'd be dead, and that they'd be dead. So that sense that one is that she's smart, two is that she's completely in control. And I think that when I realized Tammy wasn't that for me necessarily, but that she was in control enough, even in her sense of even in her embracing of failure. In some ways, that is her control. So my response to the institution, as a working class femme, from the South of the United States, suddenly becoming a professor in an English academy. My way of dealing with that was a sort of drawing the potential for failure within that, and then celebrating the success of it at the same time. And Tammy allows me to do that. But yeah, you're right. I mean, that no one had ever seen an inaugural address like that, and. Peggy was sitting next to the principal of the university, because they were all like lined up on the front row, and they all had processed in their robes and everything. And I do this thing where I throw cupcakes because I count out my age. That was the other part of it, was to celebrate the years of my 50 some years up to that point. And I was throwing cupcakes, and one nearly hit him in the head. And he just looked over at Peggy and he said, this doesn't usually happen at an inaugural address. This isn't how they usually are. Anyway.
In case you didn't know.
Anyway. Oh, I love Tammy.
That's hilarious. And the other thing, I love it when she goes to protest too. Because I don't know, I think of protest as this very serious, full of anger, and, I don't know, just it brought a completely different affect to the act of protesting. Just made it really playful and fun. And
I think that's the humor thing, is the playfulness and the fun and not taking yourself too seriously. But I also think she serves the purpose. I mean, it took me ages to become a feminist, because I would go to these feminist coffee houses or feminist meetings, and I would be afraid that I didn't know enough. I didn't have the right language. I didn't have the right platform. I didn't know all of the keywords. And I think some of us even now go to protest with a similar kind of, I'm not sure I have, I have this desire, I have this passion, I have this anger, but I'm not sure I have all the knowledge. And I think that keeps us from being engaged fully, I think. And that for me is that's one of her superpowers, that she does not have to know everything, and she can be naive for other people. Like when I've used her as an MC at particularly live art events, she's a perfect MC, because there might be some live art event that is on the first viewing incomprehensible to some people in the audience.
Yeah.
She says generously. And she can come out afterwards and said, wow, I'm not sure what that was, but didn't you like the color of her dress? Or do you know what I mean? So that she can give people a...
Yeah, no, actually, I realize we should, for our listeners who maybe are not familiar with Tammy Whynot, let's assume there might be some listeners who are not familiar. I feel like we should just give some of the backstory. So she decided to stop being a country and Western singer to start being a lesbian performance artist.
That's right.
So, so the characters about your relationship to country music stars, to that type of, or to reckoning with your childhood in the South, and with hegemonic femininity and this kind of naivete, but and also, you parody all those things, but you harness them to research very serious stuff.
Exactly.
But I love I love how you're like I'm figuring out about all this performance stuff, and they make these things called installations, and they have to have projects, and So it just really brings it down.
She kind of deconstructs the vocabulary and the jargons that often in closed communities like institutions and live art communities take for granted that everybody else knows what these things mean, and so she can play with that, and that's very. It's very what is it? It frees you up a little bit to not worry about making a mistake. I mean, Tammy, I don't know if you know this, but Tammy, I first did Tammy Whynot in 1976 when I was with Spider-Woman, and we were making a show. We decided we were going to do the Lysistrata, the Sophocles Lysistrata, and we were going to do this whole thing because it was, I think, the Iran War. There was, war in the environment, as there always is usually, and we were going to, talk about withholding sex, and we were all heterosexual at that point. And anyway, somebody had to be the Spartan woman, which in the Greek play is the country woman. So because I came from the South, I got cast as the dumb country woman. And I decided at that point to play her as a country Western singer, which I would have run like hell from, as Lois, because it would mark me as a Southerner. It would mark me as a working class, dumb Southerner. And, and I didn't want to be identified with that at that point. But Muriel Miguel, sort of encouraged me to embrace that and play inside that to see where it would take me. And she never left me after that. Tammy never left me.
That's a long relationship. Another really long relationship. Longer than your relationship with Peggy.
I think it must be genetic. Longevity must be genetic, because my parents were married almost 60 years. My brother almost 60 years with his wife. My sister and 50 years with her husband. So sometimes Peggy and I would almost break up, or we just get sick of each other. And I couldn't let go. I often thought, it must just be in my genes or my chromosomes somewhere that I do this. This is what I do. This kind of hanging on or holding on or staying with, however you want to call it.
So, so a lot of your work with Split Britches has been sort of staging things from your life and your relationship. And that has obviously impacted your actual relationship. has it, could you talk a little bit about that? Like the impact of your work on your life. I know that your life goes into your work, but I'm wondering when it goes back the other way, what happens?
I think it probably goes back the other way much more than it seems, and probably even much more than we acknowledge. I mean, we often say now that we've used performance as a methodology for confronting the challenges of our life. You know, when we get to a certain point, Peggy's a good example with when she went into menopause. How do you express menopause as a butch woman? So she made a piece, Menopausal Gentleman. And I think the working through of that piece helped her work through that period of menopause for her and that sense of identity within menopause. So I think it's, I think we literally have used it. But I mean, one of the things we also have talked about is because in the early days, we worked a lot on lesbian eroticism and felt it was important to portray lesbian eroticism on stage. I mean, we've never been a company that made work about being lesbians. We always made being lesbians the given in whatever other kinds of considerations we were making in the work. But we always wanted to be physically erotic. We wanted to be a couple, and we wanted to express that physical attraction and attention and affection. And I think one of the things, the more erotic we were on stage, the less sex we had. And these things happen in relationships, but at one point I noticed that we hadn't been having sex and we hadn't really felt like having sex, and that's all right. And then I thought, why? It's because we're doing it on stage. It's really, and that impacted us. I think the other thing that impacted us was trying to work out this expression of gender identity around butch femme and work out a change in that. Peggy was changing.
Do you ever play the butch?
That's exactly what I was getting to. I never actually played the butch, but there are quite a few of our pieces where I would get in the suit and Peggy would get into the dress. And a lot of that would be done on stage, and we'd flip in and out of it on stage where I'd be in a suit, but Peggy would rip the suit off me and I'd be in a dress, and Peggy would be in a dress. And we did that a lot. And again, that was sort of not the very early, but early-ish work that we did. And then as Peggy became more masculine identified and sort of not identifying with the trans community, not wanting to be trans herself, but identifying with that particular kind of masculinity and not wanting to be seen as a drag queen, which is, she says that's what people see her as when she puts on a dress, as a drag queen.
Right.
And as I was trying to take up more space on the stage as a femme and try to understand also what femme was, I wanted there always to be a representation of femininity on stage, but at the same time, sometimes I wanted to play the butch. So if I played the butch, that would necessitate Peggy playing the femme if we wanted to make sure that wasn't erased on stage. And we had massive fights about that. We started to have massive fights around that. So that trying to do that on stage really started to affect our relationship in a way, where Peggy thought I was trying to make her wear a dress, and I thought she was trying to, which was true because I was, but
right. I see what you're saying, though. I hadn't thought about it in that way of like, in order to then not eliminate the feminine, you've got to have Peggy in a dress.
And I know this at this point, this is, is the edge of what could be a contentious conversation. But at that point, when we're talking 1994 to 1999, or maybe even 2000, when we're having these conversations and these conflicts, and, and the trans community within our lesbian community was building, I was struggling with femme visibility. Those two things didn't go well together for me. There was a discomfort in that, as I felt like I didn't want wanted my femme visibility to be visible. I wasn't sure that it was as visible as it could be yet when we were moving in that direction. And at the same time, what was happening is more and more visible was the trans aspect of our communities. This was very early. And that was really difficult for me and very disturbing, and it became really contentious for Peggy and I in our working relationship. And it always centered around who's wearing the dress, in a way. But I mean, obviously that conversation has now infiltrated our community in a very destructive way. And I wouldn't particularly hold the same position. Although I probably deep down still hold a similar fear that I just don't want woman or femininity or the feminine to disappear. And I define woman by whoever defines themselves as a woman. Don't feel trans exclusionary, but I do feel ever so protective of what happens to representations of the feminine in this world. And I celebrate that and I protect it and I'll fight for it for everybody, whoever wants to do that. But it's a more difficult conversation to have than it was, however many 20 years ago that was. We were starting to deal with it just between us, me and Peggy.
Yeah, on one of your bios, it said something like you tried female impersonation or something. It distinguished between female alter ego versus female impersonation. How do you I mean, it sounds like just semantics almost, but I don't know. What is the difference between those things?
Well, it is kind of semantics. I mean, when we did Belle Reprieve, which was our reinterpretation of Streetcar Named Desire, and Peggy and I created that with Paul Shaw and Betty Bourne of the Blue Lips, which, if you don't know them, an amazing a drag group, but they wouldn't necessarily call them drag queens. They call themselves men who like to wear frocks, and their drag work and their performance work was so inventive. So I mean, they made whole houses, whole dresses that were meant to be aspects of architecture, and so once they came out in a number where they were all dressed up as cheeses, but in these beautiful sort of abstract drag, really. And anyway, we got together to make this piece, and Betty Bourne, who one of the male members of the Blue Lips, wanted to play Blanche. So his partner played Mitch, Peggy was Stanley, and I was Stella. So when we defined on the program said who the characters were, Betty was impersonating a woman, Peggy was impersonating a man, I was a woman impersonating a woman, using the femme of that, and Paul was impersonating a fairy. So, so we were actually using these ideas of impersonation, which I think is different from who Tammy is to me, which is absolutely an alter ego who is rooted in a different kind of place for me. And so she could show up in Butch or Femme and she'd still be Tammy.
Ah, I see. Okay.
I guess. I mean, I haven't thought about that. It's a really good question. I hadn't actually thought about that distinction, but maybe I should do the Butch Tammy. That's a good idea.
I'd like to see that. I'm sure lots of people would like to see the Butch Tammy. So, but also I thought maybe you were going to say, because it's an alter ego, it's more of you in Tammy as opposed to playing a role that's very separate from the self. Or
I think that's right. I mean, when I was Stella, as a woman impersonating a woman, I was definitely a different character. But I was still me in that character, but I think that's probably right. A good distinction.
So I want to ask also, with obviously Tammy wears this bleach blonde wig, and it's very obviously a wig. Do you think people believe Tammy, as a person? Does someone ever come up to you saying, "Where's Tammy?" After, or do they know? Has that ever happened?
Wow, that's a really
Well, just
good
because it happens to
question.
me all the time as the O show host, like when people, it's
Right.
happened to me where I put the wig on and I present something, and then like later on I'm hanging out without wig, and people are like, "Where's Oriana?" Like they don't know that I'm Oriana. So I just wonder. But with Tammy, she's more of an obviously, I don't know. I feel like the wig is more obviously a wig, or there's something about her that's like just, she's clearly like a
I think,
costume that's been thrown on.
yeah. And the thrown on is the right word. And I think that's an interesting way of thinking about how I approach femme as well. I mean, I think Sue Ellen Case wrote this essay toward a butch femme aesthetic. And one of the things she talked about in relation to me is that, yes, you might see me on the street in a dress and high heels, but the legs aren't shaved and the lipstick is a bit askew. And so there's always a kind of not quite rightness about the picture. And we might call it slippage. So there's always a crack, so that I'm not trying to complete the image of the country western singer. You could always see me through that costume. And I talk to my students about that. That's my distinction between theater and performance, is that in theater, people try to create characters. This goes back to what we were just saying. You create characters that are opaque. Actors don't want their personality to be seen in a character, whereas in performance, that's the whole point. We want to be able to see the bleed of the artist in the persona that they're building. So I think that's probably, I don't think people necessarily see me in the bar afterwards and know that I'm the Tammy, but I don't think they think Tammy's real either.
Right.
However, the thing about Tammy is that people will talk to Tammy, and I mean, they'll tell Tammy loads of stuff about themselves. That's why I call her my facilitator of public engagement, because she can ask them about their sex life in public, and they'll tell her. There's something about, I often think it's something about her not being quite real, or that makes that possible. Whereas if I was in the audience asking them questions, I'm not sure that I would get any response, or that response anyway.
Have you ever tested it? Gone around asking personal questions as Lois?
No, but I have noticed recently, I haven't been, dressed up as Tammy for a long time, mainly because of the pandemic, a couple of times during the pandemic. And I have noticed, though, that I'm much more Tammy than I used to be, even when I'm Lois. So that thing that she used to do for me, which is to help me get over a kind of social fear or an intellectual fear, inferiority, or any of those things that inhibit us, or even fear of failure as an artist. She really taught me how to manage that. I feel that Lois can do this now. I feel like that we're a little bit closer together now.
That's good. So why hasn't she come out much during the pandemic?
It's a good question. I think that the pandemic allowed me to go into a quieter, less public space, or it necessitated that in some ways. But even though we're still communicating online, or, doing podcasts, or if there are many ways that she could have stayed active, I just didn't have that. I was more introverted. I didn't have that desire for display that I think I need sometimes in order to get into Tammy. And I was doing other more quieter things, still going online, still doing things, but I was doing them as myself. And I don't know, I think it might be age too, because when we first started talking, I was thinking about butch femme and where I am now with my femininity. I think that was one of the questions you posed, and we didn't get to it. Joan Nessel says that femmes become butch as they age. And one of the reasons for that is that being femme is high maintenance. And when you get, it's high maintenance because it's a construct and it takes a lot of energy to construct that construct. And when you get older, you just don't have the energy to put it all on in the same way. And I think that might have been part of why Tammy stayed in her bag all during the pandemic. I don't miss her. I feel like she's still there, but I haven't had the urge to get her out and show her off. Maybe it's age. Maybe it's wanting to be quieter, conserve some energy, that sort of thing. Watch it. As soon as I say something like that, then that's it. She comes out, and then that's all you'll see. That's all you'll see for the next 2 years. It's Tammy, Tammy, Tammy. It's like once, because Peggy and I have had open relationships for a long time, and when that first started, I remember having a conversation with an old friend of mine because Peggy was having an affair, and we were walking through the park, and I said, no, I'm absolutely not interested. I'm not looking for another relationship. I'm so content. And it was pretty much the next day that something like that walked into my life and lasted for 9 years. So.
That's so funny. That just reminds me of my partner when we first met and we spoke on the phone. He was like, oh, love. I never think about love. And then it was like we met and it was like, I love you. I was like, oh, you told me on the phone you never think about love. This is funny.
Yeah, I always think that when I hear somebody says, oh, I'm not going to ever do that again, I go, oh, yes, you are.
You're about to.
You're just opening the door for that possibility.
That's my ploy of getting him to listen to the podcast, is that if I mention him, he has to listen to Otherwise, he wouldn't necessarily.
Well, no, he's definitely in this.
But yeah, like, how does your kind of butch femme relationship, like, how do you deal with housework? I know it's really stupid. I don't know if it's a stupid question, but like housework and like, do you divide, like, who cleans the toilet? Like, do you have, does the stereotype of masculinity and femininity impact on like the division of labor in the home?
No, I mean, Peggy looks after the car because I don't particularly like cars. And I look after the business side of things, in terms of paying attention to what needs to be done because she doesn't have an organized brain like that. She cooks a lot and cleans up. She does a lot of the dishes, thankfully. I think we pretty much have to goad each other into doing actual house cleaning because we don't particularly like it that much. I think there's a kind, if you looked at us, if we were over there and you looked at us, you'd say, oh, that's gendered in the sense that Peggy's driving, I'm doing the shopping. But it's really affinity, isn't it? It's what I like doing.
Yeah, I feel like that's usually what it is, isn't it?
Yeah. But, I just thought of this when you brought it up again, butch femme, and I thought of this when we were talking about Tammy. It's, things that have changed drastically. And, for instance, Tammy, sometimes I find it hard to celebrate the white, blonde, country western singer in the context of our racial conversations right now and our conversations about race and racism, because of the ways in which, that representation has been part of the white supremacist environment. That's not to say I would abandon her or that I wouldn't use her to try to explore that, but it's not as easy to take on that stereotype. I have to think twice about it. I have to be thoughtful about it, and particularly in certain environments. And I think the same is true of the butch femme at the moment, because so much about gender and the binary and the sort of interrogation of the binary and the non-binary, and acceptance of the non-binary, and that butch femme has very much gone out of fashion, and it's very much in some circles looked down on. It's really old-fashioned, and while I don't really mind being old-fashioned because I'm old, it's another thing that we're looking at. I mean, I don't think that when we made Last Gasp, for instance, we looked at the dynamics of relationship, and I was in a dress and Peggy was in a suit, but I don't think we really went into the same. And we did actually, because we reenacted the marriage story toward the end of the film. But I don't know. I think we had a different idea about how to use butch femme, and I think that's changed because the cultural conversation about it has changed.
That was a big part of that show, I think. Especially with Peggy's monologues.
Yeah, Peggy's trying to pick it apart and think about how to manage it. And
yeah, well, it sounds like reacting to a specific. There's a point where can't remember what she's talking about, but it sounded like she would. Oh, I think it was an anecdote of like being specifically told, like, oh, it was about wanting, being glad that you made work back in the day when you could make mistakes. You had that freedom, whereas now everything's so, and then this kind of attack of, I don't know.
She was reliving a trauma. It was a very traumatic experience, literally. That literally happened to her, where she came to the table to say things that she often does, just about what it was like when in the 70s. And she was pretty bitterly attacked, and for being trans exclusionary, I guess, or being unconscious. But I think what it was is that we were in a situation where it was a long table, and the long table had been introduced by an academic. And if I hadn't organized this long table, we just happened to show up at this long table. But I would never encourage anyone to introduce a long table, because it introduces a kind of language or a kind of expectation that goes against the whole ethos of the long table. So she introduced it with a lot of theoretical notions around performance and queerness and gender, a lot of language. And Peggy was responding to that. And she was responding to how, all this sort of theoretical theory speak, Peggy calls it, would have inhibited her creativity, and that she felt lucky that she could make it up. She could make the whole thing up. Whereas now it feels a bit prescribed. And so, that was a contentious thing to say, and she got really bitterly attacked for it, and she silenced herself for a long time after that. So this performance is a kind of trying to deal with that trauma and come out of it a little bit and talk about it.
Have you experienced anything that made you want to silence yourself in a similar kind of way, or?
No, because I think maybe I don't take the same kind of risks that Peggy does, so, in that sense. Where we used to have this thing where people said, I whispered and Peggy shouted. That's part of our sort of dynamic. Or I'll set up a structure so that other people can talk, and I'll contribute and I'll have an opinion, but I don't sort of put my opinions out there as much. I'm more interested in drawing other people's opinions and finding the balance in those, for better or worse. I'm not celebrating that, because sometimes it's aggravating. But I would say that this goes back to our conversation about collaboration. There's one time when I wanted to quit, and that was the result of a bad collaboration. And that, we didn't really set ourselves up properly to start the collaboration, so that it came down, after a while, it came down to issues of ownership.
With Peggy or with someone else?
With someone else, with another person.
Right, yes, I remember that was a key thing in the workshop, was about like coming up with some kind of contract at the beginning, some kind of agreement about, yeah. I thought was a really good advice.
It was a friend of mine who was in business gave me that advice, and said, it doesn't even matter what the contract says because it gives you something to change if you want to. But we didn't have a contract or even a clear understanding. And it ripped us apart at a time when when the show was going really well. So it just felt like, and I thought I'd leave performance and never go back, but I did. And we're friends now. So it's not like, that's another thing that I've learned, is that even in these riffs, because I had a riff with Spider-Woman, I had a riff with this person, time is a great healer. And after a certain amount of time, we live in a small community. We need each other. We have to depend on our mutual aid for each other. We're friends now. You get over it. You move on.
Well, that's good.
It is good.
Yeah, it's very hopeful.
That's my little vision of hope for the future. Just be patient and let time do its work.
That's great. That's really good.
And I'm going to say I'm going to talk about time for a minute because I was just in a conversation about conversations, and one of the things that came up was time. And someone was a panel, and someone said that time was a marker of care. I thought they said time was a maker of care. But either way, I think that one of the things that gets in our way when we disagree about, gender identity or racial politics or vaccines, that we don't really give each other enough time, to sort of talk it through or think it out loud. And we don't allow for awkwardness and silence in our conversations so that we can wait and see how we think or how we think other people think.
Yeah. And I think it also, if you're going to communicate with people who feel differently or who have different views, like you need to have a lot of empathy or like patience or I don't know. Yeah. Something that a lot of, that often when you have, really strong views, you don't have,
No, you just get up and walk off the porch because, you don't want to even engage in the difficulty. It takes time to do that.
Yeah. So I want to ask, there's many things I want to ask. Oh yeah, but I just want to kind of agree with you about the whole academic starting. I don't know. For me, it's like anything could set me off on not being able to participate in the long table. But I like when Hamja brought up the long table being this wonderful thing that allows conversation. I was like, I've been at a long table and I went up to the table and I wanted to contribute, but I just was still too shy to say anything. I didn't even write anything down, and I had to go home because I had a little baby at home and I couldn't stay. And it was just like, I don't think it always does open up. And he was like, you just negated my whole point. I was like, I don't mean to, because I've also done my own long tables and found it was really good, like with students and stuff. So I'm not knocking the whole thing. But I think it had to do with like certain academics being at that table and having already sort of, and just, I don't know, when anything's at the Live Art Development Agency, I just feel very like anxious and like it's like this is the space that's supposed to be supporting me. I better not fuck it up here. I don't know, like this is the one space that might support me. Let me not mess it up. So yeah.
Absolutely, I get it. I mean, here's the thing. The reason I sort of say that it's as open and democratic as I do say it is that usually there's at least one or two people who come to the table and talk and share an experience that wouldn't have if it had been a panel discussion or if it had been something that was more formal. And at least there is that option to do that. But I don't deny that it still takes a lot of courage to get yourself to come to the table. I also don't deny that the framing of it makes all the difference in the world, and I agree with you about something like anything that you're invested in, like the Live Art Development Agency, or I mean, I'm not all that invested in my institution. I feel like my job is to actually confront my institution. But at the same time, I can be intimidated if there are, some highly competent academics in the room that I value, and I wouldn't want to sound like an idiot in front of them. I'm shy as well. But I often say to people who say that to me, you did that, but just get yourself to the table.
I got to
just
the
get
table.
yourself to the table. You don't even, you don't have to talk
I know.
at the table. You could just be there. You need listeners at the table. Yeah. It's okay, it's okay to be shy.
I know.
think that's okay.
I know. That's what Hamja's like drilled into me already anyway. I know it's okay to be shy. I know it. I know it's okay to be shy. But yeah, what you were talking about, like all the things you're talking about around Tammy, just like it's spot on with this thing that I've been exploring, shame attacking, which is this therapeutic technique within rational emotive behavior therapy. I go on and on about this, so it's really probably boring for my listeners to hear it one more time. But it's about acting against your self-inhibiting irrational beliefs and doing the thing you fear doing and getting the response you feared getting, but you unconditionally accept yourself anyway. Which is, so you permit yourself to fail and to fuck up and whatever. Just so exactly what you're saying with Tammy. But interestingly, when I met like the UK's leading expert in this form of therapy, he said that if you do it as a persona, it's not as effective therapeutically because you can compartmentalize it. So I was like, oh my God, I've been doing it the wrong way. And, but exactly what you're saying though. It's like, I don't need the wig. I could still go on and be Oriana, the host, without the thing. So I could, but yeah. And I think it is that the two personalities, just like you and Tammy, are getting closer. But yeah. I don't know what my question is. I'm just kind of.
I don't know if I agree with that person or not.
You don't have to.
I mean, I don't know. Look, I don't know a lot about the therapy you're talking about, but I do know something about shame. And I do know that when I'm working with personas for people, or when I'm even doing creative hosting workshops, which is something I've done, particularly within the academic environment, I mean, that's the place I go to. What is the place where you feel you could feel the most ashamed? What would make you feel the most ashamed in this particular social situation, or that kind of, and build the persona on that, and then let that persona act you out of that. You're not going to act out of that on your own. It feels like you need the right outfit for that. You know what I mean? I don't know. I think that's where performance can really help us, because we can practice it without taking that full terrifying ride on our own. I don't know.
I agree with you, because also, you just need a little bit of protection. Like some things feel so risky that you want that little extra protection.
I mean, the thing I feel right now about failure in performance, or failure in a conversation or panel, whatever, when you have to show up and be somebody, is absolutely down to Tammy. And if it hadn't been for Tammy, I would never have been able to go there, where I can remember as Tammy standing backstage thinking, oh, well, this could go terribly wrong. I have no idea how this is going to work out, but I kind of know that as Tammy, I can get myself out of it, whatever it is. I mean, and that little conversation that I'd have with myself as Tammy, I am now able to have with myself as Lois, where I kind of almost enjoy not knowing what's going to happen. And, if it fails, figuring it out in the moment. I never would have gotten there without the persona. I don't think.
I know. I mean, I feel the same way. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that kind of leads on to my next question, which is obviously you spent a long time doing this autobiographical performance. So I'm wondering, like, what has felt the most risky? Like, what thing have you revealed or thing have you done that has felt like the most challenging?
I think Well, I try to work with the first thing that comes into my mind and not censor that. But what I came up with was this piece that we made, Peggy and I, called Lust and Comfort. And it was a piece that interrogated a long-term lesbian relationship. And it was at the point where we were seeing other people trying to redefine our relationship or even dissolve it. Who knew at that point? But we were trying to bring some of that reality and that conflict and that change onto the stage. And you know how, like, I was starting to, like, understand I had a different sexuality than the sexuality I had with Peggy. I was interested in other sexual practices than the sex that we had. And I was trying to articulate that on stage, you know, as a part of this whole big, crazy performance about long-term relationships. And the whole premise of the piece was, what are you willing to risk for lust or sacrifice for comfort? That's why we called it Lust and Comfort. And not knowing really on the other side of that performance whether we'd be together or apart, because there was a lot going on. And that felt exhilarating, but it felt like the scariest. And I do think I revealed more things about myself in that piece than I have in some of my other pieces.
And did that, obviously it affected your relationship with Peggy, but what about for you personally? Do you think that taking that risk had an impact on you, like on how you kind of are in the world, or has anything that you've done? I mean, obviously you've talked about Tammy and you becoming closer, and that obviously is an impact on your everyday way of being, but just, are there anything else?
Well, I guess the massive impact of that is that it was after that I situated myself much more in London and Peggy in New York. So we had much more of a physical separation, which that was already in effect because I was our co-artistic director of Gay Sweatshop at that point, and Gay Sweatshop produced that show. But I hadn't quite dug in to also being a resident, you know, in London and living that at least half, or if not more than half, the year in separation. So we did separate, but I think we separated better than we might have if we hadn't done some of that work. And did I manage to fulfill my sexual desires? I think I did. Yeah, as a result of playing with that on stage. And I was just thinking about it. I do think that was also a really early beginning point of me and Peggy rethinking our gender identities on stage. Because we worked off of 3 shows. One was The Servant, you know, this film, Joseph Losey's The Servant, where we both played male characters.
Okay.
And then we played off of Fassbinder's The Bitter Tears of Petra van Kant. We did 3 different films, basically. And there we played then I really played the ultra femme. And we dealt with that relationship. So, I think we were starting to pick a lot of things apart in that piece.
So, speaking of, like, you know, getting what you want sexually. So all your research.
Yes.
all your research as Tammy into sexuality, getting older and sexuality. Like, tell me some of your findings.
Well, I mean, again, that came about because I didn't feel the desire for sex as much as I had as I was getting older, which could have had, you know, there's loads of reasons for that. But I didn't want to necessarily think that was just it, that was, you know, once you go through menopause, that's it. I didn't believe that. And I also knew that people weren't talking about it. So I thought, at least I want to talk about it. At least I want to find out what other people feel. And it was not conclusive. I mean, people feel loads of different things. Like I met, women in their 70s, late 70s, who were on dating apps and going out with a different man, every night. And then I've met women who absolutely had no interest whatsoever in sex to start with or to end with or whatever. And then I met women who might have had interest in sex, but because they were in an older heterosexual world, knew that having a sexual relationship meant having a relationship in which they would become carers for the man again and refuse to even entertain the idea of having sex because they didn't want to get themselves into that position. I don't think I recovered my libido as a result of that research. I felt happy to be in good company with other women who maybe would have sex, but not necessarily wasn't the biggest thing in their life anymore. And I began to, I don't know if it was that piece or not, but I began to fall in love with my work. And I felt I felt sexy in my work. And so I basically just fell into that acceptance as a result of that research. But there's loads and loads of women who are really very sexually active in their 70s and 80s, that was encouraging. But didn't change my feelings, I don't think, necessarily. But you never know. There's so many things that impact our desires for sex. Sometimes it's health. Sometimes it's circumstance. Sometimes I just started to really love being solo, being singular, and enjoying my own time. And then I realized, I wouldn't mind having sex, but I don't necessarily want to spend the night with anyone. I don't necessarily want to wake up with a new person and have to get to know another person. Then you think, oh, maybe it's not sex, but it's intimacy that I'm having. So you go through all of those. But I did carry on having sex for a while, and I probably will again, but I'm in a kind of quiet space at the moment.
So speaking of, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I don't know if it's of any interest to anybody, but you're welcome to it.
Speaking of getting older and are you going to retire or do you have a pension? I just want to know really stupid practical things. Do you have a pension?
Well, I do now. I have a little one because I've been teaching at Queen Mary for 20 years. And I have this phrase that I've always said that I'm going to have to work until I die because I retired in my 20s and 30s. So, because I didn't work. I mean, I worked, but I worked lots of different jobs. And so I didn't have a pension then. And I didn't get a pension until I started working at Queen Mary in my late 40s and 50s. So, loads of people said, I got a job at the university right out of college because I wanted to establish my pension.
I know, I feel very worried about it for myself and stuff. Hence my asking you.
Yes. And I'm becoming nervous about myself too, because what happens, I've said this to someone recently, come Sunday, I want every day to be Sunday. When I think about, okay, Sunday's over now, the work week starts on Monday, I would just as soon be Sunday for the rest of the week. And I think, does that mean that I'm ready to retire? I don't think so. I mean, I love my teaching. I love the work that I do. I get more tired. And I also feel like, there are things I'm not as quick at or as good at as I was, 20 years ago. But I think I could manage for another 5 or so years, maybe longer. So I don't have any plans to retire. And also as artists, we never retire, do we? I mean, that's not something you retire from. But if you're talking about retirement as an economic thing, I mean, look, I'm lucky also because I have a really cheap apartment in New York. And so I could potentially live on the little bit of money. If everything went well and I didn't get ill, I could. But having worked for a while, I got used to going out to dinner, and having a nice bottle of red wine occasionally. I don't know if I could give that up. I'm going to have to work to support my habits.
So I think that might be all my questions.
Shall we retire on the retirement question?
On the retirement. That's good. That's good. Yeah, I'm just glancing at my questions and seeing there's nothing. Yeah, that's it. That's great.
I'm aware that it has started to rain in the last few minutes, and so when you get this recording, there might be some raindrops falling on our heads.
That's fine.
That might be what you hear.
All right, I'm sure it'll be fine. Great.
Oh, good. Well, I've enjoyed this. Thank you.
Me too. Thank you. Well, that concludes my discussion with Lois Weaver. I hardly edited it at all because it just seemed to flow so well and touched upon so many topics that interest me, and that she brings such a fascinating perspective to bear on. I hope you got as much out of it as I did.
Next time on Multiple O's.
Next week, we'll be departing from the usual Multiple O's guest, which so far in the series has featured mainly artists. So we're going to take a little bit of a turn, speaking to a sociologist and coach, Jo Van Every, who wrote a book called Refusing to be a Wife: Heterosexual Women Changing the Family. So that's something to look forward to next time on Multiple O's.
On Multiple O's. Next time on Multiple O's.
Thank you so much for listening. If you're enjoying the series so far, please do tell all your friends about it. Until next time, I'm going to keep unconditionally accepting myself, my life, and other people, and I hope you'll do the same, because we're all just fallible human beings.